Welcome everyone. Absolutely delighted to host our first webinar of 2022. And also that it's on a really important subject, climate change governance and the role of the board. And we will leave plenty of scope for question and discussion afterwards, but we wanted to perhaps just share with you some of our thinking to date. So Kate, if we could click through, please. And again, please. So today I'm joined by my colleagues, ranging from Steve, who covers capital markets and stewardship, Mark, who's the head of the search practice, and Alistair on ESG and strategy. And I think you'll see there's a logic to this holistic approach to the topic that we're covering today. Next chart, please. And we've divided our discussion, very much the governance of climate change, into two parts. One, looking at what's happening, what we're seeing in the boardroom. And then the second part, looking at some of the developments with regard to investors. I think many of you are sitting on the boards of quoted companies and would agree that the role that institutional investors are playing here is very important, and sort of understanding the drivers there, I think, is also incumbent on board members and beneficial. Next chart, please. And before we actually move on to the presentation, I'd like to ask your opinion. And we've made this slightly binary, and I know that for most of you, the truth will probably be somewhere between A and B. But really, just to sort of get us started, let's address the question: does your board have a good grasp of climate change risk? A, yes, my board is well informed, alert to the risks and able to prepare. Or B, no, my board underestimates the disruption and business model risk that climate change presents. So we can't vote on this. So I'm going to rely on Kate and Amy to let me know when the votes are in. And perhaps we can share. Oh, this is almost like, I was going to say it's almost like a Brexit vote. I shouldn't say that, but it's very close. But interestingly, yes, my board is well informed, 54%, and 46%, no, my board underestimates the disruption and business risk. So actually much closer. And I think that result will actually be borne out in the charts that we'll go on to share with you. Next chart, please. As I mentioned, we're approaching this from an holistic perspective. The three areas that we engage with boards on are composition, effectiveness, and really through the evaluation work, and strategy and purpose and ESG. And I think from all three perspectives, we can see evidence of boards really preparing themselves with regard to climate change. And if we move to the next chart, if we look back over the past year, at the beginning of the year, the FT wrote that only 7% of board members were climate competent, meaning they knew enough about climate change to understand how it could affect their business. I would have said over 2021, that position changed quite dramatically. And we saw specific areas where you could see a great deal of activity. On the search side, for example, key roles became much more important, and the thinking around those roles and the demand for those roles increased. And that was, for example, the sustainability committee chair or a head of sustainability at executive level. And we could also see, and here if I refer perhaps to chapter 0, a lot of evidence of board members really equipping themselves with sometimes starting from grassroots level of understanding of climate change. On the evaluation side, we could certainly see a strong interest in ESG and climate change competence. And we, for example, we hosted a number of modules last year on Section 1721 reporting, and clearly climate change is one aspect, one of those sort of stakeholders that's reflected in that regard. To the extent that if we move to the next chart, we can see chairs asking very specific questions. Firstly, the skills in the boardroom. Is there an adequate understanding of climate change and its implications for the business? Is there experience in addressing climate change through the board agenda? So the Sustainability Committee chair, and also that willingness to learn. I mean, clearly these are entering into the criteria for searches and board composition and skill matrix. Equally, the board is taking a keen interest at executive level. We've seen a number of CEO transitions where this has been an important criteria for the CEO. Obviously for the ExCo, this is important. And again, boards are also taking an interest in how that sustainability officer role is filled and conducted. And on the effectiveness side, we're absolutely reviewing how is this addressed in the board agenda. Is there an alertness to the opportunities as well as the risk? And many boards are perhaps more developed on the risk side than the opportunity side. How effective is the board in monitoring progress towards net zero? Far from an easy task, but how are boards beginning to think through the reporting and also the ambiguity? And specifically the decarbonisation, what progress is being made there. So to an extent, this is becoming a core competence also for the chair as it becomes part of the overall effectiveness in directing the company and the board. Next chart, please. And there's a good reason for this. We'll come back to the investors because I think they are a major driver. But certainly, if we look just in the UK, you've seen that the UK has committed itself to net zero emissions by 2050 and on a legal basis. So there is an absolute sort of legal framework for this. Equally, all premium listed companies in the UK will have to make TCFD related disclosures from now. And so we are beginning to see a real sort of reporting imperative there as well. And also by 2023, most large companies and organisations in the UK will have to show and demonstrate how they intend to hit their climate change targets in line with the net zero target at UK level. And so you're beginning to see a framework where boards have to think this through. It's not a nice to have, it's no longer optional. It may be beyond their tenure, but it's part of the regime that they're working within. Next chart, please. And while there's debate about COP26, it did undoubtedly move the agenda on. You could see that we ended up with following the pledges that were made at COP26, it looks like a current landing of 1.8 to 2.4 degrees Celsius. So still not where we need to be, although a move forward. We had commitments with regard to deforestation. We had commitments to phasing down coal. We had the US and China agreeing to increase climate cooperation, and Mark Carney's initiative, which potentially links 130 trillion of private capital to backing those net zero emissions. And I think one of the most important things that did come out of COP was that there's no longer this chicken and egg of business waiting for government and government waiting for business. It's clear that business is beginning to move ahead, and therefore boards do have a key role to play in meeting these net zero ambitions. Next chart, please. And I've taken the liberty of citing chapter 0 here, interpreting what COP26 means for boardrooms. Firstly, that shift from ambition to action. So moving from the interest and the statements of commitment to actually ensuring that implementation is happening. Secondly, embracing opportunities for collaboration. And I think one of the really interesting things for boards to think about is much of their climate change responsibility may well lie beyond the legal entity. And so being able to work through influence and through supply chains, for example, is going to be critically important. Without a doubt, the reporting and accounting for climate change, this is tightening and tightening, and boards do need to have confidence in how their company is reporting to investors. The implications of systemic change, in particular within financial systems, and this is going to hit quite quickly because probably all of us individually and all companies will be caught up within the reporting requirements of financial services companies. And it's really important that we don't move to unintended consequences from how banks, insurers, asset managers are responding to this. And undoubtedly preparing for the cost implications that we're already beginning to see work through the system in quite unexpected and dramatic ways. And so I think that sums up some of the sort of the framework that we're seeing boards responding to, but also I hope gives a real sense that, you know, we are seeing boards respond. And perhaps just going back to chapter 0, which is perhaps one metric, you know, you can see that well over half of the FTSE 100 will have at least one board member who's a member of chapter 0, and therefore leaning in and actively engaging in the process of learning about climate change and its governance. Next chart, please. And I'd like to now move to my colleague, Steve Cheetham, and look a little bit at the backdrop, because one of the main drivers is clearly that sort of financial ecosystem that we were talking about on the last point, and how investors are viewing climate change and the boards of the companies they invest in. And so, Steve, can I hand over to you to take us through an update on how the investment community is thinking about climate change and in particular its implications for boards? Welcome. Steve, you're on mute.
That's definitely the phrase of the moment, isn't it? And one always forgets. So thank you, Gillian. Yes, so climate change and investors. Well, the first slide I have on this, I think, talks about the key interface between boards and the investment community, which is reporting standards. And I think the first thing to say in this arena is that although we've been doing accounting really for quite a long time, the reporting framework for climate change is still in its infancy. So the daddy here really is TCFD. TCFD's been around now for 7 years. It's a jolly good high-level framework, and it's been very much sort of approved of and endorsed by the great and the good. I think the issue with TCFD is that it's a great high-level framework, but it's not an accounting standard. And so it's quite possible for companies to report according to TCFD and actually be reporting quite different things. So TCF is the beginning rather than the end. And I think one of the good things that happened in 2021 was that IFRS finally got going and decided they were going to do their own International Sustainability Standards Board. And this is essentially going to be the accounting standards for climate change reporting. This is in the category of somewhat dull, but really important. However, it's very much at the beginning of producing a comprehensive global baseline, and the timing of its recommendations is still pretty unclear. The other point that's sort of unclear is whether or not the US market will play ball. As you probably know, IFRS is very widely accepted outside of the US, but a lot of companies within the US stick to US GAAP. And whether we have a sort of two-tier ecosystem for climate reporting, I'm afraid is still open. The third parallel initiative that we have on reporting standards is the EU's sustainable taxonomy. Now, this has been in the news a fair bit recently, and what it is essentially a classification of businesses and disclosure requirements for companies and for investors. This being the EU, it's been accompanied by a lot of politics and a lot of horse trading. And the obvious question here is, how green is nuclear? You know, if you ask a French person, they're likely to say nuclear is pretty green. If you ask a German person, they're likely to say it's less green. So we've got a real issue with the EU. I have little doubt that at some point the taxonomy will be fudged, as most things are in Brussels. But it's really important what the flavour of that fudge is, because what is agreed in Brussels is extremely important and is likely to set global standards. So as with GDPR, I think the rest of the world is looking very closely at the EU sustainability taxonomy. So the bottom line on the reporting standards is it's a work in progress. Next slide, please. If we then move on to the investment industry itself, the headline really is that the customer wants ESG, the customer wants climate friendly. Now, the investment industry is still, and I think will continue to be profoundly challenged by the growth in passive investment and increasing transparency on fees and on business models, which have, in the past at least, been quite comfortable and quite obscure. And so in the money management world, we're really seeing the sort of strategic polarization you get in a number of businesses. So in money management, you've got the big boys, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the Fidelities at one end, and then you've got the niche players, the hedge funds and smaller ones at the other end. And the middle ground that used to be quite a comfortable place to live is becoming increasingly less so. In addition, traditional investment strategies are under a lot of pressure. The value investment style, which historically has been a great way to manage money, has really underperformed for the last, I put a decade here, it's probably closer to 15 years. And tech has been the great runner, but as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, tech is pretty fragile, can be pretty fragile, and valuations are very high. And in parallel with those listed strategies, we've also got private equity. And private equity have done extremely well, particularly in infrastructure. They've had a period of great growth, but just like quoted investment, they face increased scrutiny on their performance. Private equity can sometimes be somewhat eccentric in its performance measurement, its fees, and crucially also on ESG factors. So if you throw climate positive money management into this industry, it looks like a jolly nice new segment. It looks like a good opportunity. And what's happening in the money management business is that the marketing machines are already in very high gear. There are issues with this, and there is already a high profile lawsuit happening in Germany against DWS, the German asset manager, for essentially relabeling of existing portfolios as green when perhaps they're not really. So the risk of greenwashing is very high. In addition, the marketing case for ESG funds has been greatly helped by the fact that tech has been such a runner. So if you do your numbers for a climate-friendly investment fund, you'll probably find there's a fair amount of tech in there, and there's really not a lot of grubbier, more carbon-intensive industries that tend to be value investments. And so ESG fund performance and climate-friendly fund performance has had a big tailwind from the fact that there's been a bull market in tech. And I think most of us would agree that although that's been very nice, it's unlikely to go on forever. So the summary here then is that there's very strong demand for green investments. Climate governance is very high on the list of concerns for investors. But the status of green investment within the investment community is still, I would characterize it as being, complex and difficult to negotiate. Next slide, please. And whilst we're talking about complex, if you haven't already read Bill Gates's climate book, I highly recommend it to you. It's slightly dull, but it's very good and it's very well thought through. And what Bill Gates puts his finger on in a number of parts of that book is the complexity of dealing with what you could term legacy CO2 heavy businesses. And so the business of climate-friendly investment isn't just about divesting securities. Because as he makes this point here, if you sell your shares in a steel company, that doesn't mean that people in India are not going to get steel to build basic shelter. What's going to happen is those assets will continue to produce carbon. They will continue to produce steel. All that's happened is their ownership has changed. And it's quite possible, as Larry Fink has already said, that we are creating, through a pressure on climate-friendly funds to divest, and oil companies and steel companies to divest, what we're simply doing is creating an arbitrage opportunity. And we wind up in a world where all the carbon-intensive assets are not publicly owned, but rather privately owned, and quite possibly privately owned by shadowy institutions. So there's a great degree of complexity here, and there's a great degree of complexity for boards. And what this does, of course, from an investment perspective, is really change the focus of the board. If you look at, for example, an oil company that has decided to funnel some of its cash flow towards investment in green technologies, well, as an investor, you might have had a great degree of trust in a CEO and a chair who know how to run an oil company. But do they know how to run a tech venture fund? And that's the reason why some oil company stocks are really languishing and are really not very highly valued. So the whole thing is jolly complex. Next slide, please. So if you look at this spectrum of ESG and climate active investment, as in with most things, you get a range. And for this slide, we are indebted to our good friends at Georgeson. And what we're saying here is on the left, you've got the kind of conventional asset managers, BNP, Robeco, AXA, who integrate ESG into their portfolios. And as you move towards the right, you get a fair amount of sort of active ownership, people who have companies or other investors who are following ESG strategies and climate-friendly strategies. And then you move over to the impact investors. On the right-hand side, you wind up with a focus activist. So that's the final thing I'd like to talk about a bit, is the climate activist. Now, we're quite comfortable, perhaps, or quite used to seeing activism on a financial basis. But what we've seen, and there's no shortage of this in the press, there's a lot of activism today from a range of groups, and you can see some of them on this slide, such as Unfriend Coal, Share Action, Climate Action 100+. These are activists who are seeking to change the strategy of a company for it to be more climate friendly. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll just explore some of the complexities that are in that. So climate activism, ESG activism, what's the difference between a climate activist and an ordinary activist? Well, an ordinary activist actually just wants a financial return. A climate activist wants a better planet, wants fewer carbon emissions, a more stable place to live. The beneficiaries from a traditional shareholder activists are pretty much the shareholders. But in the ESG arena, it's much more around a broader range of stakeholders, so it's society as a whole. The alignment of a traditional activist is pretty high with investors and shareholders. The alignment of an ESG activist is pretty unclear. Remember, as an ESG activist or climate activist, you're popping up out of nowhere. You might have a few shares so you get access to the meetings, but ultimately you're not necessarily aligned with everyone else. The playbook and the strategy for financial activism is pretty well defined. It's usually around financial returns, balance sheet efficiency, selling off bits of conglomerates. The whole ESG activism thing is a lot less well defined, and I would say untested. And then if we move to uncertainty and challenge for the board, we'd say the outcome uncertainty is actually very high, and the challenge for the board is potentially extreme. And to go back to the obvious example of an oil company that's divesting some of its oil assets and moving into clean energy, that really does require a whole new bunch of skills and a whole new bunch of board focus around where we're going, what we're trying to do. So I would leave you with that point that climate activism is one of the things of the day. It's one of the, I'm sure we'll see lots more of it, but how it pans out remains highly uncertain. And I think, therefore, that it provides a big challenge for chairs and a big challenge for the whole board as to how to respond.
Thank you, Steve. And before we move to the next chart, if I could just say, if you have questions, please can you send them in via the Q&A function. We'll monitor the chat function as well, but if you have questions, please via the Q&A function. Thank you. Next chart, please. And really just to tie up the two elements of our presentation today, the implications for the chair, the implications for the board. Firstly, without a doubt, ensuring that the board develops an understanding of the implications of climate change for the company. And this is quite a big move away from just having one expert sitting on the board. There is an increased expectation of a sort of a rising tide of understanding, and that there's undoubtedly a sort of a minimum level of understanding that all board members should have with regard to climate change. Secondly, and this is picking up on, although not exclusively relating to Steve's point about uncertainty, one of the sort of, I guess, consequences of TCFD is absolutely having to think in terms of scenarios. And we are seeing that companies that are comfortable with scenario planning and comfortable with running scenarios are better placed to think through the uncertainty and the ambiguity. Whereas a very linear approach and very linear thinking can be very challenging. And so the second point here is just the finding methodologies, finding mechanisms for coping with uncertainty and ambiguity. The third point was also picked up in the Chapter 0 summary from COP26. This is an opportunity for innovation but collaboration is really important as well. And so I think here the board can undoubtedly play a role of thinking through how, within the frameworks of sort of competition and legal boundaries, the company is able to influence, engage. And I would say we're already seeing evidence here of, as companies think through their scope 3 reporting, absolutely sort of requiring from their suppliers that they begin to put in place the climate change reporting that we've been talking about today. The fourth point, as the board ensures that climate change and ESG are embedded in the strategy and that KPIs and remuneration are aligned, critically important, and both the reporting side and also that really embedding ESG, and this is where the board does play a critical role. And then the final point is dare to be bold. The board has to show leadership here. And net zero will not be achieved without a bold leadership, but think very carefully about the integrity of communication. Steve mentioned several times today greenwashing in the context of investors, and so investors are becoming very sensitized to this issue. But also we're seeing boards being held to account both for the sins of omission, so not taking sufficient adequate steps with regard to climate change, but also for the promising, over-promising and under-delivering. And I think this is an area that the board will absolutely need to engage and need to ensure that it has comfort. So these are really the sort of the steps from turning ambition into action, which I think is a very good way of thinking about sort of moving to the next stage. And what I'd like to do now is really open up to questions. And maybe just a first question for Steve, and that's on the performance of ESG funds. I mean, you talked a little bit about the sort of the tailwind and sort of what's happening, the underpinning tech. But what is the appetite for and what is the the sort of the industry opinion on the performance of ESG funds?
I think the simple answer to that is it depends. The bottom line has been that ESG funds have performed quite well over the last 10 years. If you do the analysis on them, I think it's a big piece of this is that ESG means different things to different people. So it's quite consistent with a number of other streams we've seen in investment for quite a long time now. Much of this depends on where you're coming from. So, for example, if you're a Muslim and you want halal investment, then certain things are halal and certain things are haram. And it's the same in ESG, and all the investment houses have different screens. And by the way, there are a number of companies seeking to build brands in this area. They're best known as perhaps Sustainalytics. So the first point is, what's an ESG fund? It's really quite hazy. Many of them have done very well, but there's a big question going forward as to whether the high-level justification for ESG investment, namely that you do well by doing good, I think there's a big question mark around that. And I note on the chat as a related question regarding Unilever, and that ties actually very nicely into this, because what it really says is, if you scratch an ESG investor, what they're really about is profit and return. And I think there's a lot of marketing going on here. And I think ultimately companies need to be very, very cognizant of the fact that just having a good ESG performance is not enough. And I think what Unilever are finding is, because Unilever's been great on ESG for a while, that they were under Mr. Polman. And I think the bitter truth is investors want both, and companies that don't deliver both are going to be punished. And you can see that, that's definitely starting to happen at Unilever.
Thank you. And maybe just picking up on that point, Steve, it's a very good point. One of the things that we're certainly seeing boards looking at very carefully is how the two functions of stakeholder engagement and shareholder engagement are conducted. And they need to be, if not fully integrated, they clearly need to be working very, very closely together. The ESG team need to understand what the IR team are seeing and hearing in the market, and vice versa. And I would encourage those who are sort of sitting on quoted boards to take a keen interest in the caliber, but also how those two functions are working within the organisation. A second question has come through, and this is for Alistair, and that's, we touched upon point 4, I think, for our takeaways for chairs, was ensuring that you haven't got a sort of an extraneous ESG strategy and a core strategy. Many boards struggle with this, the bringing the two together, and the reason it comes to the boardroom is very often because it is difficult. Can you talk through what you've been seeing and where you've been seeing boards actually make headway here?
Yes, thanks, Gillian. I think really supporting a lot of the points that have been made, in that strategy still does have to deliver returns as well as delivering kind of climate benefit. I think what we've been seeing is kind of probably 3 trends, and all of them I think will be familiar to most of the people listening. The first one is the trend towards strategy driven by purpose. The board has the ability to set the framework within which the executive develops its strategy. And increasingly boards are insisting on purpose-driven strategy. And in particular from that, the consideration of a broad range of stakeholders, so shareholders and other stakeholders, and their materiality and their interests when developing strategy. And that's probably the biggest step that you can make in terms of integrating climate change into real kind of strategic thinking. By taking either considering the environment as a stakeholder, which is very often a very helpful way of building this into your consideration, or just by, when considering stakeholder, interests, just considering what stakeholders' interest in climate change is. And increasingly we're seeing that coming not only from the more obvious sort of regulatory or community type stakeholders, but increasingly from investors as well, as Steve was saying. It's very often now a requirement of investors. So I think moving towards a kind of purpose-driven strategy automatically forces you to integrate climate considerations, and that's one thing that boards are doing a lot. And associated with that, I think also is insisting on the kind of risk and impact analysis as set out by TCFD to a great extent as part of any strategic decision making. Because while the executive is probably taking the lead in developing strategy, the board has a huge amount of has the power, if you like, to insist on the framework in which the executive is operating. So that, I think, is the first and probably the most important thing. The second thing that is important on boards now and increasingly recognized is ensuring that there is climate competence on the board, and that there are the structures in place for the board to effectively challenge the executive in the area of climate change. Because the role of the board within the development of strategy is really to challenge the executive on some of the assumptions they're making, some of the strategies they're developing. The board can't do that on climate change unless it has the appropriate degree of competence in that area to really be able to challenge. So I think building climate competence onto the board is really important to challenge the executive. And the other benefit that has is that it signals very strongly to the organization that this is something that's being taken very seriously and is a lot more than just a bit of a sideline that's tacked onto the side of strategy. It's really fundamentally part of strategy. And then just quickly, the third point I think that is important for boards to think about is to make sure that once they're developing a strategy that is climate friendly, that all of the levers that they have to actually oversee the implementation of strategy are also aligned. So the most obvious one that comes up most often now is remuneration. The board has a lot of control of remuneration. And shareholders want to see remuneration that is aligned with climate goals as well. But there are many other levers that the board can pull in terms of the way that risk is overseen, the decision-making processes that have gone through, what information is required before a decision is made. And all of those processes need to be considered by the board, because aligning all of that behind a strategy to deliver both financial returns and kind of climate sensitivity is a very powerful tool the board has. And we call all this kind of package of things the ESG leadership grid, because it basically says there are a lot of things, a lot of moving parts that have to be aligned in order to develop and then to implement a climate friendly strategy. Sorry, that's probably a bit longer than you were expecting, Gillian, but that's kind of, I think, all of the areas in which we're kind of, seeing the board taking an increasing role in aligning the strategy and climate change.
Thank you. And that obviously is the holy grail of embedding the two. We are getting more questions, and I'm going to cluster the next sort of group of questions around composition and search. And I'm going to bring Mark in here if I can. The first question is relating to, I guess, commitment and passion for climate change, and a question where the board's really looking for people who are really driven and passionate on the subject of climate change, or would prefer a sort of a slightly more dispassionate and professional approach. And the second question relates to, how do you find these skills, given that we've emphasised ambiguity and uncertainty, and we've emphasised that it's not a climate change expert. So how do you find these skills? And I don't know, can I bring Mark in at this point to some views just on that climate change competence and what you're looking for?
Yes, thank you, Gillian. I think here we're not going to ever find somebody who has spent a lifetime looking at climate change who can then join the board, because they've got that wealth of experience that they've built up over a number of years. So what are we looking for in terms of people who have this capability? probably more than and ability rather than experience. So we are looking for people who've taken a real interest in this area of climate change, and also have continued to develop their learning around the subject matter. So those are the sort of qualities that we're looking for in such people. As Alistair mentioned earlier, it probably may be combined with other areas too. So we talked about remuneration. We've also talked about reporting, so understanding these aspects as well and how they fit together. I think also there are, bodies like Chapter Zero, which has become very successful in assisting board members understand the implications of climate change from a board perspective. And so there is a group of people who've already started to develop a greater understanding and interest in this area. So I think those are some of the key attributes that we are going to be looking for in people who are joining boards and can support the business around its purpose and its strategy, as Alistair mentioned, in addressing this agenda.
Thank you. And the first part of the question related to, is there a preference for, I think, non-believers or those who aren't sort of passionately committed? And it's a really interesting question. And I think what to me is really important, what I can see is working really well, is board members or candidates who are able to link their understanding of climate change and their commitment to climate change to the specific company and the specific sector. So they don't necessarily need to be sector experts, but it's being able to translate, it may well be passion, but it's being able to translate that into the practicalities of, what does it do to the competitive environment? What does climate change mean for the individual business? And those will be some of the areas to sort of focus on, almost the practicalities. I don't know, Mark, if you've got anything to add on the sort of the believer versus the non-believer in terms of hiring for climate change.
Well, I think you do need to have people who really believe in this, otherwise it's very difficult to perform the role. But I think your point is also managing ambiguity, which, there is no right or wrong here, but it's people who can think in a structured way in frameworks to manage this area that is, it's just full of complexity and as you said, ambiguity. So how you actually navigate this through this requires people with structured thinking, at least to be able to address the multiple stakeholders in the interests or the best interests of the company. But I do think you've got to actually believe in what you're about and in the subject matter.
Thank you. And we've received one comment which I think is picks up on the ambiguity and uncertainty point, that one of the skills that boards benefit from is business model transformation and ecosystem collaboration, and that reverts back to the scale and the extent of the change, and helping chairs and board members get their arms around really very non-linear solutions. So would very much agree that the ability to deal with a high degree of change is becoming increasingly important over a number of sectors. We've received another question, which is about the whole process of education and ongoing education. I know we've referenced Chapter Zero quite regularly, but any other thoughts on keeping those skills fresh and learning? I mean, one of the things I'd add here is that I think now you're seeing most business schools are introducing courses focused on climate change, not necessarily on governance. And one of the points that I perhaps highlight is that for board members, there's also that intersection between governance and climate change. I think most of the professional services firms from whichever angle, for example, the Big Four, will be supporting their board members quite extensively. We'd also expect, within the organisation, I mean, one of the things we've seen is that this sort of segments across employee engagement. Very often that there's a high degree of passion for climate change and within the organisation. And so board members might also want to sort of make sure that this dovetails with their employee engagement and skills. I don't know if Alistair or Steve have anything to add on the sort of that learning, that ongoing learning.
I would just add, learn by doing. So I think it's really important to be practicing, to be a live board member and to be doing some of the, facing up to some of the challenges, which are there's a very wide range of challenges, and there's not just one climate change challenge for boards. I think there's much of this depends on the materiality of it to people's businesses. So I would just say the thing to do is to keep your skills fresh, and you do that by practicing.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions coming. I'm going to take them in reverse order. There's a question: should climate competence be added to board skills matrix in proxy circulars? Let's just take the whole question of skill matrices, and then particularly the question of proxy reporting. I know we're certainly seeing that this is becoming part of the skill matrix, but I don't know, Alistair, if you wanted to add anything there, and then Steve, perhaps on whether this should actually be included in the proxy reporting. Alistair.
Yes, I mean, talking of the skills matrix, certainly, and we're doing, as you say, a lot of work on skills matrices. I think because, just in general, there's a lot more concentration on getting a board that has the right skills on for the strategic challenges ahead. And for all companies, one of the strategic challenges is addressing climate change and what you're going to do about it. So I would say, one, yes, we definitely see boards getting more and more interested in trying to make this more scientific, using a really quite rigorous approach to skill matrices in terms of developing their boards going forward. And I would say definitely climate change is becoming something which every company should be considering to build onto their board, because sure as anything, everyone is going to have to address that in terms of the strategy going forward.
Thank you. And Steve, do you want to add a word on I guess, how ISS is going to be thinking about this? Yes,
I mean, my initial reaction would be there's an awful lot of things on the proxy statement already, and I think you might start confusing people. How ISS and Glass Lewis start, and the other proxy guys start doing this, is a very interesting question. I mean, I would almost be going back to the blindingly obvious point about tech competence, which is at some point climate competence stops being, oh, well, we have one person on the board who does this, and it starts being a broader skill set that's shared across board members. And in a way, I think the shared responsibility and the shared competence is probably more powerful. So I think it's going to be a while before ISS starts voting against board candidates because they don't have demonstrable climate change competence. I think that's a way away yet.
Thank you. I mean, we have seen, and I've seen letters from shareholders to chairs questioning the level of climate change competence on the board. And I think one of the points here is also being able to evidence and give comfort. And so one of the things perhaps for board members to think about is not just the sort of the learning that we've been talking about, but also how to give comfort to shareholders, I think is a really important point here. And maybe, again, I'm going to take these questions in reverse order. We have a question about how can boards be most effective in influencing large investors to take longer term views in recognition of climate change initiatives that are likely to need the sort of the longer term horizon. Well, Steve, as a former investor, what would you like to have seen from boards in terms of building this consensus about the longer term?
I think what you're looking for as an investor is always a good story, but you're also looking for engagement on a range of topics, and particularly if you've got a company that's undergoing a major transformation because of the challenges that lie ahead. I would be just looking for really good, really consistent communication, availability of CEO and chair to talk to major investors. And I'd be looking for very, very good IR and a very, very good proactive approach by IR in terms of managing the information flows. How much of that an individual investor chooses to take on board is naturally down to them, and levels of engagement vary a lot depending on what sort of style the investor has. But from a board perspective, I think there needs to be a really good story that's proactively communicated. And if you do that, investors will normally sit up and take note.
Thank you. And I think, you could quickly get to, should there be a shareholder resolution or not? But I think Steve made really practical points there about, making sure that the quality of the overall engagement with investors is high quality, taking a real interest in what is being communicated to investors. And I guess as a board, being able and willing to support that communication. I mean, this obviously all needs to be very coordinated, and typically there are only certain issues that board members will communicate directly with investors on. But this may well become an area. I mean, it's certainly becoming an area of focus. So would completely endorse Steve's comments there. We're approaching the end of the hour, but I just wanted to, there's another question here about sustainability accounting standards. And I wonder whether we could add to that ratings as well. And I wonder, Steve, whether you perhaps had a few thoughts on how boards should be thinking about this sort of increasing classification of companies, but both the broader issue of sustainability accounting standards, and then perhaps the narrower issue of the influence of rating agencies with regard to how investors interpret investment opportunities in the space.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, the truth is it's still a bit of a wild west. There's a lot of different rating sort of systems being used by various people. As I mentioned earlier, Sustainalytics is one of the more widely used. But the big problem with them is that they all look at different things and they're not consistent. And there has been some decent analysis done of this, and the bottom line is they're not correlated with each other at all. So I, as a board, I would first of all take ratings with a large pinch of salt. I would expect that to develop over time. I think if we were having this conversation in 10 years' time, it'll be a lot clearer who's well rated and who isn't, and the frameworks will be a lot more stable. But I think as a board, and I think as a company, taking it with a pinch of salt is one thing, but you also need to understand it. So I would be definitely, getting part of, whether it's the IR team or someone else in the company, to really understand what's driving these ratings, and how you might, without wishing to manipulate things, how you might be able to influence the ratings for the better if they pick on things which you feel are inappropriate or whatever. So I think really take with a pinch of salt, but really do understand them as well, and see what you can do to improve the dialogue.
Thank you. And yes, taking with a pinch of salt. I mean, I think taking into a broader context and not allowing the tail to wag the dog.
Precisely.
We have a very interesting question, which we'll just try to squeeze in from Elizabeth. And this is about the extent to which climate change and broader ESG metrics are being taken into consideration for REM. I mean, we are certainly seeing a lot of work being done, particularly in sectors that are obviously impacted, and we've conducted sort of benchmarking across those sectors. What we've found is that there isn't necessarily consistency as to which metrics are being used, and we've also seen quite a high degree of changing the basis. And of course, investors don't like that. They don't necessarily criticize it, but you can see with ESG, we're all learning, and there could be unintended consequences. We've seen a number of boards or REMCOs move to or adopt indices or a basket of metrics, which may be a sort of a better way, provided there's trust in how that basket was formed and there's transparency about why something's been included or excluded. So we're definitely seeing a move to including ESG. We're seeing companies being voted against if they don't have ESG as part of the remuneration metrics. But we would advocate quite a cautious approach to how you build those metrics, and often a blend of the sort of maybe qualitative objectives and quantitative objectives, because this is an area where we are seeing sort of unintended consequences, and every company wants to avoid chopping and changing its own policies. Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add anything from the investor perspective there.
Yes, I mean, this is part of the REM discussion, whether you like it or not. I think what investors are looking for is a mechanism, but I think they're also looking at that mechanism within the overall framework of how the company is performing. And I would absolutely echo the point about not chopping and changing the REM policies. If there's one thing that investors hate, it's chopping and changing the REM policies.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're coming to the end of the hour now, and we're going to have to wrap up. I can see that people are beginning to leave. So if we could perhaps just move on to the final chart, which is just an update from our side, some of the future of webinars that we will be hosting in collaboration with others and on our own. So please, if you're interested in any of these, do get in touch. If you're interested in receiving the material, please again do get in touch. I hope that what we've been able to evidence today is that climate change competence is being taken very seriously in UK boardrooms and internationally, both in terms of composition and in terms of board practices. It's a new discipline. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I think those themes have come through, but we are beginning to see practices and good practice, and we really look forward to sharing that with you across the course of 2022. Well, thank you all very much indeed. Apologies for the technical glitches, and we very much look forward to welcoming you back in future. Thank you. Many thanks. Bye-bye.